Now Thomas Hearns is an open book for Ray Leonard. Backs up against the ropes.
This is one of the most unusual calls by a referee in the history of the sport.
The first loss. A tremendous victory. Leonard fighting off the ropes.
It happened. It happened. Uppercut by Douglas. Down goes Tyson.
Hooks in right hand shot.
Excellent. Knocks out by Tyson.
Slumps to the canvas.
The champion struggles to stay on his feet.
How do you like it? How do you like it?
Welcome, fight fans, to another episode of BTR Boxing Podcast Legendary Nights. And this episode has been voted for by you, the users of Twitter, the listeners of BTR Boxing Podcast. And the subject for this poll was On the Verge of Defeat. And you voted for Froch versus Jermain Taylor from 2009. Froch's first defence of his WBC super middleweight title. But before we get into the episode today, I want you guys to go and check us out on social media at BTR Boxing Pod on Twitter and BTR Boxing Podcast on Facebook as well. Please go and subscribe to the podcast. Apple Podcast is the main platform. Find us on there, subscribe, leave us a rating, leave us a review, let us know what you think of the podcast. Also, we are on Podbean, we are on Stitcher, on Spreaker, on Player FM, we're on all good available podcasting apps out there, we're even on Spotify. Just type in BTR Boxing Podcast and you will find us there to follow us and listen to all the latest episodes. So Johnson Brown's going to be going through this episode with me today. We're going to be covering off the tale of Froch versus Jermain Taylor from back in 2009.
So coming up, our main event, Frotch has fought only once in America and only once on U.S. television last year on Showbox. The undefeated Frotch is a bone-chilling puncher, folks, with a rock-solid chin and a steely determination. In England, they would refer to him as a hard man. There have been a handful of outstanding super middleweights from the UK, including Nigel Benn, Chris Eubank, and most recently, Joe Calzaghe. Those champions all fought here in the States.
So, this is Froch versus Jermain Taylor from back in 2009, and one of the greatest shock comebacks in boxing to date. It's definitely one that springs out in mind, as I felt like Frotch was losing. He was losing on the card in this one, and then for him to come back and produce a stunning upset at the end of the fight, it was an unbelievable way to make his mark on American soil, and I'm really excited to be talking about this one today, Johnston.
Oh, I'm really excited to be talking about this one. It was a remarkable comeback from Carl. As you say, he was blood on two of the scorecards. I had him down myself, as you rightly pointed out, you did too. And he had to take him out, and that's what he did. And it was brilliant. Absolutely outstanding finish to the fight, and it was one that will always live long in the memory for myself, and I'm sure with many boxing fans.
And going into this, as we talk about both of their careers, we forget how storied of a careers they both ended up having over the years, and just pointing out one particular fact from the off, Jermain Taylor was actually the favourite going into this fight, although he wasn't the champion, and although he was moving up to super middleweight after spending the majority of his career at middleweight and doing really well down at middleweight. He was actually the favoured fighter in this particular fight, even though Froch had just come through a fantastic fight with Jean Pascal, which we'll touch on shortly, and he was the WBC champ going into this fight, and he was actually the underdog, strangely enough, going into this fight. It was crazy to think that he was the guy that was going over there with the most recognised title in boxing, the WBC title, and yet he was the guy that all the American fans were like, who the hell is he? Who is Froch?
Yeah, it's quite funny, really. I think even Jermain Taylor in the build-up to the fight was mentioning who is Carl, sort of thing, you know. But Carl had done it over here, especially. I think we all knew who Carl was. I think most of us had followed Froch's career. I think with the idea that hopefully it'd eventually fight an aging and coming to the end of his career, Calzaghe, which didn't quite sort of come to light. But yeah, interesting how Jermain had become the favourite, considering obviously his two defeats against Pavlik as well. So yeah, really interesting. I suppose maybe the fact that he's on American soil, no one quite knew where he stood, whether he was good enough to compete with a guy like Jermain Taylor. So yeah, interesting fact really. And Yeah, and I think even more makes it even more impressive that Carl did what he did.
So let's go into Carl's career first and foremost then and talk about Carl. Obviously for us being UK-based fans and UK-based podcasters, Carl is obviously to us, he's a bit of a hero really in terms of boxing and what he's been on to achieve after this particular fight. Again, we'll touch on that in the aftermath segment of the show, but going back to when I first was introduced to Carl as a fighter, I'd say it was around 2004, so he must have had about 10, 11 fights before seeing him fight for the Commonwealth super middleweight title against Charles Adamu and getting the victory on points over Charles there. And then from then on, I started to follow his career as he progressed, and the only other time he'd actually been over to America prior to the Taylor fight was in 2005 against Henry Porras. So it was his second visit going over to America for the Taylor fight. But I'd seen him from the moment he beat Charles Adamu, and from there on I started to follow his career as he progressed on and picked up the British super middleweight title at the end of 2004. And then that's really when I started to think, I really like this guy. I really like his style. He's just dead unorthodox, the way he puts his hands dead low, and the way he just sort of it's strange because he's got this sort of style which kind of, it's like a fencing type style. He sort of throws the jab out in anticipation of throwing the great right hand over the top as well, and he's always made a career out of it, to be honest, with the way he's done that. And as his career's progressed on throughout the years, it's something I've really enjoyed watching, but sometimes it's not always been something I've enjoyed watching as well at the same time, because sometimes he's notorious for being such a slow starter. But going back to Frotch's career, when was it you first got introduced to Frotch as a fighter?
For me, I knew of Frotch sort of roughly around the time when you picked him up, but mine was a little bit after yours, Sean. For me, it was sort of the Robin Reed fight. That was the one that caught my attention. But even before then, I had heard of his name. I'd seen bits and fragments of Frotch. And as you say, he had that style, didn't he? At times he almost went sort of, he would throw that jab and, as you say, follow it up with the right. And he almost ended up square on at times, which is always quite interesting because, you never taught to be square on. But when he really went on the assertive and he went on he was being aggressive, he would just keep throwing left and right. And that always was something that always stood out for me. And obviously throughout his career, he ended up finishing off guys that he knew when to do it, though. There's times, obviously, you don't want to be cool sort of square-footed because you're going to get put away, but you got to know when to do it. And I think that ability gradually come to the forefront in his career. But yeah, Robin Reed was a time when that was the fight I did watch of Frotch's live, and I really enjoyed it. Robin, I knew Robin Reed before that, so, and then obviously going on to the Jean Pascal fight was definitely one I remember watching clearly, and when he picked up that WBC title.
Well, some of the most notable fights I would say Frotch had leading up to the Jermain Taylor fight was obviously when he first picked up a professional title, like I said, when he picked up the Commonwealth title. Now, he did win the vacant British Boxing Board of Control English Super Middleweight title, which was back in 2003. But that, is regarded quite highly in terms of the smaller hall events that we have here in the UK. But once you sort of get past that level, you're looking at Commonwealth, British, European, and then moving on to the Worlds. Significant fights for me was when he beat Charles Adamu. Another significant fight was when he knocked out Brian McGee, who was a right tough opponent, and when he defended the British and Commonwealth titles against Brian McGee. He had a great war with Tony Dodson in 2006. That's a fight that I would say to listeners who might have not seen that part of Frotch's career, go and check out the Tony Dodson fight from 2006. That was an absolutely fantastic scrap between two warriors, and that's a fight that I would say was quite significant in terms of getting to see how much of a granite chin Frotch had at that early stage of his career. Bearing in mind he'd been a professional for 4 years at this point, he really had that granite chin and that hard punching style that at that point as well, and it was only a matter of time before he was going to progress on. And as you said, rightly pointed out, he faced Robin Reed, who at this point of Robin Reed's career was arguably way past his best. Let's be honest, Robin Reid was a champion of the 90s. He was a WBC super middleweight champion in the mid-90s to late 90s, and he had some great fights himself. But I think at this point in 2007, Robin Reid was, for me, way past his best. And then before the Jean Pascal fight, he had a good fight with Albert Rybacki as well in Nottingham, who was 15-0 at the time. Frotch fought him and he stopped Rybacki, and that led into this fight with Jean Pascal, which was probably my favourite fight of 2008.
Oh, yeah, it was up there, wasn't it? It got voted. I don't think it got voted the fight of the year, but it was definitely a contender. It was a real good scrap actually, and Jean Pascal was he was a tough guy, and it was interesting to see how Cold come a lot sort of guts come up against him, if you like, and obviously the vacant title was the WBC, so neither were champion going into the fight. It was a good bit of business to bring Gene over to Nottingham, and it was just absorbing. I remember from literally sort of around a friend's house, and we was just every minute of it, we loved it, and it was pretty tight. But I think I say tight, although we won it sort of unanimously. It was a closer fight than if you just look at it on paper. Yeah, he's won it unanimously. It's like he's just shut him out. To be fair to Jean Pascal, he put on a decent performance himself, but I just think Cole really sort of put to the forefront his ability and showed the world that he's a real name here now, and and as I've already mentioned, obviously I was following mainly through this point. Was Calzaghe. Calzaghe was obviously the guy I watched regularly, so I always knew of Cole. I didn't know how much ability he really had. I'd seen the odd fights, and I think this was the fight. I think obviously you've mentioned the Dobson fight, which was a good scrap, which I look back on. I didn't watch it at the time. And then Robin Reid. I think that for me was the Robin Reid, although, as you say, he was on the slide completely. He retired in the end, didn't he, as well in the fifth. So I think you're completely right there. Robin Reid was never really that test. I think Jean Pascal was that big test for Cole, and he proved that he's got the potential to be a world beater, and boy, did he prove it.
Oh, he certainly did. The Jean Pascal fight was a fantastic fight, and I remember it was back in the days when ITV picked up a lot of boxing, so it was on terrestrial TV here in the UK, and we was able to watch it for free, and this was one of the great fights that you got to watch for free on the telly. And we always talk about some of the stuff in the early 90s when we got to watch the likes of Ben and Eubank go at it. They were actually free to air as well on the telly, and we've not seen a lot of it in recent years because of all the pay-per-view stuff coming into fruition. So this Jean Pascal fight on ITV for us was fantastic because we were getting the opportunity to see this British fighter undefeated going in against another fellow undefeated fighter for a world title, and it was huge for us because we want to see another super middleweight champion, and obviously when we had Joe Calzaghe around at the time, you got to remember Joe Calzaghe had literally just retired after the Roy Jones Jr. fight. He'd retired the month earlier, so Joe Calzaghe had fought Roy Jones Jr. in November of 2008, and obviously Frotch really wanted the fight with Calzaghe, which we'll touch on a little bit later, and Calzaghe decided to hang it up and call it a day. So then it's kind of a passing of the torch situation really, where we get this fight with Pascal, which was a fantastic back and forth fight for 12 rounds. Now these guys, I've got to be honest, the way they both absorbed punches and the way they both threw punches in this fight, it was a real rock'em sock'em phone box fight. It was really, really good. And if anybody, again, that's listening to this episode, if you've not watched the Jean Pascal Carl Frotch fight, then I really strongly recommend that you go and watch that fight. For the sheer volume of punches and punches landed, and the fact that this really was the coming out party of Carl Frotch.
Yeah, it really was. It was brilliant. Do you know what? I actually forgot it was an ITV show. I really, just reminded me myself. It was brilliant. It really, really top fight. I mean, as I say, I don't recall off the top of my head what other fights there were in 2008, but this was definitely one of the best fights of the year. And it was just great to see finally, another British fighter pick up a world title, and obviously the WBC, which is highly regarded across all the main organisations. But yeah, excellent fight, and as I say, I mean, although it was unanimous, I sort of forget that. I know obviously Frotch won the fight, but it was just a brilliant fight, and it was just end to it, like, you know, it was just constant basically. They landed so many powerful shots, and they both showed granite chin. And as I say, Jean Pascal was a great fighter. You know, if anyone, you say look at the fight completely, watch this fight and just watch Jean Pascal, who's a fantastic fighter to watch. Really was sort of similar to Cole, where they, you know, if you like watching the tear up, then go and watch Jean and Cole, and you know their styles gelled perfectly.
So then we move on then, and we talk about the opponent, and it was Jermain Taylor, the man that had dominated the middleweight division over the past 3 years before moving up to super middleweight. So touching a little bit on Jermain Taylor's middleweight career, it was quite well documented at this point in time in 2008 how good of a fighter Jermain Taylor was. Now, Jermain Taylor had worked his way up throughout the rankings in the middleweight division, picking up numerous ranking versions of the WBC title along the way, and then he eventually got his shot at a certain Mr. Bernard Hopkins in 2005, but that was after beating the likes of Raul Marquez and William Joppy on his way up to get that shot at Bernard Hopkins. Now, Bernard Hopkins at this point in time, I think he was the longest reigning middleweight champion. I think he'd been champion for about 10 years or something ridiculous like that at this point in time. So he'd been
12 years.
There you go, 12 years. He'd ruled the division for 12 years at this point in time, and he come up against a young, fresh, hungry, hard-punching Jermain Taylor, who beat him in the first fight by a split decision, which was, some might say, was quite a controversial one, but watching that one back, I felt like Jermain Taylor had just edged it, and I remember watching that fight at the time because I remember not knowing who Jermain Taylor really was at this point, even though he was well into his career, and I knew who Bernard Hopkins was, but I didn't really know who Jermain Taylor was. And to see him go in there and put it on Bernard Hopkins the way he did was like, wow, you know, I like this guy. This is a cracking fighter. And subsequently he got the rematch and beat Hopkins in the rematch as well.
Yeah. I mean, that same as you. That was the first time I had a Jermain Taylor up. You know, it was the Bernard Hopkins fight. It was billed as next in line. Bernard Hopkins, obviously, on a tremendous run, 20 consecutive successful defences of his title. You know, he was unbeaten, hadn't lost in 12 years. Well, he was beaten, but, you know, unbeaten in 12 years. He was the man, wasn't he? He was 40 years old as well, Bernard Hopkins. It's just unbelievable, isn't it? He's been it's just unbelievable. But yeah, it was a very close fight. I mean, most people, you know, most of the pundits and reporters in and around and watched the fight believed that Hopkins won the fight. I think several had Hopkins winning the fight. I think when I first watched it at the time, I really couldn't tell you. It was so close. I mean, you could give a round to someone else. You know, you look away from the TV for a minute and look back. You've missed a couple of shots. You end up giving the other guy a round. That's how close it was. This was a very, very, very close fight. And Taylor done the business. I suppose just looking back in his career, the one thing I will say is the William Joppy fight was probably his fight that sort of got him in line for this, the Hopkins fight in the end. But yeah, he lost the first fight to Hopkins in a way, and Hopkins weren't happy with that. Weren't happy about it, and he made an appeal, which obviously was unsuccessful. You know, he had a moan, but never mind. And then obviously Jermain Taylor, you know, he was from Little Rock, and he basically came back to a massive parade in sort of with all the belts, and he actually went to meet Bill Clinton. So this guy shot to fame from his victory against Bernard Hopkins. And then in the second fight was just as close. Exactly the same. I think Taylor definitely won that fight for me, but it was just as close. Very, very close fight. And yeah, it was looking great for Jermain. He was doing great things, and he, you know, the first guy to win the undisputed titles in just one fight, and that's a record that's still around today. He is the only guy in the middleweight division to have held all four belts.
Crazy, isn't it, with all the politics that go on, that, you know, that happened and has not happened since, and we're 14 years down the line from when that originally happened. It's absolutely mental to think that all the politics that play a huge part in today's organisations and the way the governing bodies still work today is crazy. But yeah, shooting to fame by beating Bernard Hopkins, there's no better way to do it, really. And now Bernard Hopkins, as we know, was the guy just couldn't help but have a moan at anything throughout his career, you know, considering what he went through earlier on in his career, you know, the fact that he lost on his professional debut, the fact that he was in prison for a period of time, and the fact that he got beaten early on in his career of absolute prime Roy Jones Jr., and then for him to go on the way he did and dominate the middleweight division for such a long period of time, yeah, there was eventually going to be someone that came along and dethroned him, and that was Jermain Taylor. And Jermain Taylor at this point in time I think he was a phenomenal fighter in the middleweight division. I think not a lot of people give him that credit he deserves. Even today, like I say, even 14 years down the line in the middleweight division, I think if you threw a prime Jermain Taylor in with one of the big guys we've got in the middleweight division today, I think you'd see some cracking fights, absolutely cracking fights. He was a brilliant fighter in what I would say was his prime. So then he moves on, 2 wins over Bernard Hopkins, proving that the first one wasn't a fluke. And then he goes in against a 53-fight veteran in Ronald Winky Wright, gets a draw in that particular fight. And at this point, the only titles that were on the line were the WBC and WBO title.
Yeah, that's right. I think he got stripped, didn't he, of a couple of the titles. Not quite sure the ins and outs of that. I think it was probably to do with a mandatory. That's what I'm guessing. Tends to be the case, doesn't it? But yeah, it was another very tight fight against, well, that doesn't know, Winky Wright, another excellent fighter. Sort of to the end of his career at the time as well. I think he went on a bit of a downslide after that. If I remember rightly, he lost, I think, the last few of his fights after. I can't remember off the top of my head who they were. I haven't really looked into it, to be fair. But yeah, Taylor, again, you know, it was a close fight, but I think he was his manager, I think, Ozell Nelson, that was unsatisfied with Taylor's progression between the first and second fights of Hopkins. So he actually convinced Taylor to replace Pat Burns, who was his long-time trainer, with Emmanuel Stewart. So Emmanuel Stewart coming for the Winky Wright fight, and obviously it didn't quite go to plan. It was a close fight, as I say, and you know, again, you could go either way, but this is the level. You know, you talk about Wright, you talk about Taylor, you talk about Hopkins. These 3 guys were the 3 best in the division, and they all fought each other, which is something we do get. Obviously, we've seen Canelo and Golovkin, which is nice, and it's like the third one's going to happen. But you know, it just shows you that, you know, even though it was, you know, back in 2005, 2006, these guys were fighting each other, and Taylor was coming out on top. Although obviously he got the draw in this, it was close. It was very close. So yeah, and obviously that was when he went on to made a couple of defences, didn't he? He fought Kassam Uma, who I'm not too familiar with, and then Corey Spinks, who I am. And that was another tight, good fight.
It was, and them 2 fights, I think, really put him in good stead for what was about to come, which was another young, hungry, undefeated middleweight in Kelly Pavlik, who came there 31 fights undefeated. Relatively unknown to the wider boxing audience. Obviously, if you was an American fan back in 2007, you probably would have known Kelly Pavlik really, really well because of the exposure that the fighters get over in America. But over here in the UK, he wasn't as well known at this point in time, so people had only really just started latching on to Jermain Taylor as a middleweight fighter, and then Kelly Pavlik came along and dethroned him in the first fight, which was, for me, where we started to see the flaws of Jermain Taylor really come to fruition. I think Jermain Taylor's stamina was one of the issues that would always trouble him throughout his career, but wouldn't become as evident until he got involved with the likes of Kelly Pavlik and obviously Frotch, as we'll talk about later on. But the Kelly Pavlik first fight, Kelly Pavlik came in there and absolutely did a demolition job on him, and it was quite shocking to see, because I think Jermain Taylor had this aura of invincibility at this point of his career, the confidence and a slight arrogance, I think, at times from Taylor at this point, because I think maybe the people around him was really overinflating his ego at this point, and whilst he seemed a genuine down-to-earth nice guy in a lot of the interviews you would have seen him in, you could tell that some of the stuff he was saying in press conferences and build-ups, you could tell people were whispering in his ear a lot back then, and I think that had a major impact on the way he went out there and the way he trained, or didn't train enough, or didn't do things correctly in camp, which led to the ultimate demise and the loss of his middleweight titles in the first fight against Kelly Pavlik.
Oh yeah, it was another good fight, and he did sort of, as you say, his vulnerabilities were clearly exposed by Pavlik. They actually fought during the amateurs as well, which Taylor defeated Pavlik back in 2009 in the United States Olympic trials. But in the first fight in particular, the second round, Taylor actually landed a right hand, followed up with 7 more punches, which resulted in the first knockdown of the fight. So Pavlik actually went down in the second, but obviously he managed to recover well, and in the end he got rid of him. with it was a great knockout. But I think, as you say, it was just one of them. Eventually, I think it was gonna come back to bite Taylor, where he would start fights pretty. He would dominate the opening stages of a fight. Behind a lovely jab. He always worked well behind his jab and followed up with nice combinations. But as you say, the gas tank was emptied, and he was just running on empty a little bit. He wasn't quite right. Obviously, not training properly. Pavlik landed that right cross that literally put Taylor into the corner, and then in the end, he just finished him off with a right hook and an uppercut. It weren't looking great. Taylor, obviously, he straight away, within a month, he was on the rematch. He wanted to get the rematch with Pavlik, and which happened. And then again, Emmanuel Stewart, he was fired by Taylor. So you can see Taylor's camp sort of on it was falling apart, really. I mean, a bit like we mentioned with Mike Tyson the other week, but he was sort of going down that same route. So in the end, the second fight, and he lost by unanimous decision, this time against Pavlik.
Today's episode of BTR Boxing Podcast is sponsored by Bear Attack Boxing. Check them out on social media, on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter, and check out their website www.bearattackboxing.co.uk. They've got another great product that's just been released, the Bear Attack Boxing Master 1 Focus Pads. They are the ideal pads for perfecting your boxing skills, for getting your shots accurate and fast. With the shock absorbent pad, your hands and wrists will be protected. The hook and loop strap makes it easy to secure your hands in the pads. So go and check out that new product, which is only $24.99 at www.bearattackboxing.co.uk. Social media, Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. Find them, Bear Attack Boxing. He did, and obviously again Pavlik proved that the first fight wasn't a fluke either, and he obviously reigned supreme as the middleweight king at this point after beating Jermain Taylor for a second time. And then he decided at this point it was time to make a move up in weight, and he did, and he moved up in weight to fight former Joe Calzaghe opponent in Jeff Lacey, and he beat Jeff Lacey via unanimous decision in 2008, at the back end of 2008, which gave him the opportunity and ranked him as the number one contender for the WBC title, which was then won a month later by Carl Frotch against Jean Pascal. So the fight with Jeff Lacey, obviously that was two American guys. Jeff Lacey, as we know, was hyped up to be a beast before Calzaghe did a little bit of a number on him back in 2006, and he was on the comeback trail. He was looking to get back into title contention, and he had this fight with Jermain Taylor. Jermain Taylor beat him quite convincingly via unanimous decision, and then Jermain Taylor got himself into the position to fight Carl Frotch at this point, and this is kind of where now we come on to the next segment of it, which is the build-up. But the Jeff Lacey fight with Taylor, that was quite an interesting one, because these were two guys that were former champions and former guys that have been put there as potential elite level fighters. I mean, Jermain Taylor, I think, had essentially done his part in becoming an elite level fighter by beating Hopkins, but I don't think Jeff Lacey had done that. But yeah, he was thrown in there with the chance to become the number one contender for the WBC title, which was held by Frotch.
Yeah, that's exactly what it was as well. It was an eliminator, wasn't it, for the super middleweight division, for the WBC super middleweight title, which obviously was held by Carl Frotch after beating Pascal. And it is interesting because obviously Jeff Lacey was apparently this killer, wasn't he? He was like the smaller Mike Tyson, they dubbed him in America. They thought he was going to be the next best thing. And then obviously, we all know what Joe Calzaghe done to him. He literally done a number on him. He battered him left, right and centre. And then for 12 rounds, it was an outstanding performance from Calzaghe. So obviously with Taylor, with the two Pavlik losses, those two first defeats, first time he'd ever been down in his career, Taylor. So it's a matter of licking his wounds and getting himself back on the saddle and try and get himself back in contention. And obviously decided to move up in weight. Again, that's sometimes it's an indication where they're either struggling at the weight or it's because they're not training too well. So it's difficult to work out. I think looking at the history of Taylor and how it developed going on from this point, I'm guessing he probably wasn't training too much. And I think, obviously, maybe the fire, he lost that fire out of his belly when he first started and come out of it as a bronze, he won a bronze medal in the Sydney Olympics. So obviously, coming through his career was always, he was managed by Lou DiBella, he was on some big undercards at the MGM early in his career. So, to get to this point of his career and have every single title, undisputed, maybe the situation is that maybe a few too many blows close to the head, going the distance, starting to lose his marbles a little bit, as well as the fact that, maybe that, that fire in the belly's gone. But, he's still produced good performances, don't get me wrong, but obviously Jeff Lacey as well, trying to come back from a humiliating defeat. So it's an interesting fight, and Taylor did do a number on him. You're right, Sean, he absolutely battered him.
So then we get the build-up to the fight between Frotch versus Taylor. So Frotch was coming over to America for only the second time in his professional career. And funnily enough, as I was saying at the top of the show, Frotch was also not only the underdog in betting odds for this fight, he was also actually ranked lower in the Ring Magazine rankings, despite being the champion. So he was actually at number 6 in the Ring Magazine rankings, and Jermain Taylor was ranked above him at number 5, which is quite strange given the fact that Jermain Taylor had only recently moved up to the super middleweight division and had only beaten Jeff Lacey to become the number 1 contender. So he was automatically given this on a plate when you think about it. He was given the opportunity straight away when he moved up to fight for an eliminator. So he gets his opportunity, and yet he's still ranked above Carl Frotch. But for me, Carl Frotch was the guy that needed to come over to America, and he does say it when you watch the interviews back in the lead up to the fight. Frotch is being asked by Al Bernstein about, why do you feel you need to come over to America, and what is it about America? And it's like, well, he needs to make a big statement. He was talking about the fact that he needed to make a statement. He needed to come over to America, make the statement. He wanted to be in big fights. He didn't want to be in fights against people that nobody knew who they were.
These sort of fights, winning them in style against a marquee name like Jermain Taylor, is how I'm going to establish myself. I want to become a superstar in America to show people what I'm about, what the Cobra can do. I'm ready for him. I've just beat Pascal in a great fight over 12 rounds, which is being dubbed as Fight of the Year. I'm WBC World Champion at super middleweight. I want to get straight into these big fights. I'm 31 years old. I've not got 5-6 years of sitting around doing nothing, wasting time, defending against people that nobody's heard of, when I can catapult myself to superstardom.
So this was it for him. This was the start of Frotch's magnificent run of fights that he had right up until the end of his career, and he was very much right in what he said in the interview with Al Bernstein. He said he didn't want to be involved in fights against people that nobody knew, and for sure this was the start of the run, which is probably one of the most toughest runs in boxing history. I mean, I'd like to see what other runs compare to this in boxing, but this was one of the most toughest runs that you can see anybody have in this day and age. It was unbelievable, the run of fights that he went on, because you got to remember, after this we had the Super 6 tournament after this particular fight, so that's where we'll go into in the aftermath segment of the show. But yeah, going into it, he wasn't really known in America, nobody knew who he was coming over, he was just this Englishman, as he was referred to a lot by the broadcasters on Showtime. He was just an Englishman coming over who was a hard man. They were the words that the broadcasters were using. He's known in England as a hard man. That's what they had him down as. But no, I really enjoyed the build-up between the two of them, because Jermain Taylor, he was quite confident and quite cocky and quite arrogant, and I think he felt like his previous victories over some of the biggest fighters in boxing were going to put him in good stead against a guy who nobody knew.
I had reached everything that I wanted to accomplish in boxing. And here it is, I got all this money, and I'm relaxed now. I'm not making no excuse, because that's my own mentality. But I feel like that's what happened. I just think, it's boxing. In boxing, either you're up or you're down. Either you're number one or you're nothing. I miss being number one. And I didn't think I'd get that back, but I do. I miss having those belts. And, being looked at as champ, when a person called me champ, I know I really am. Number one, how to keep it, how to keep that drive. And Carl Frotch, he's an overseas guy, comes to fight. He never lost, so he don't know how to lose. I'm just gonna take the fight to him. I'm gonna teach him how to lose.
Yeah, and he was pretty clear in that in his statements when he did keep sort of bringing that up. The fact that who are you? No one knows who you are. Look, basically, I'm Jermain Taylor. I'm this superstar, and yeah, it's funny that Frotch came in as the underdog. I suppose the fact is, coming obviously going on to American soil, I suppose that's probably the one thing you could say. But for me, I think it was, Jermain obviously moving up a weight and also being beaten twice by Pavlik. Frotch being this young guy coming in, and he was eager. And the interview you mentioned just there with Al Bernstein was, he weren't lying there, was he? I mean, you hear it today with some fighters, and they will sort of say, after this is it. I'm going to continue. I just want to fight big fights for the rest of my career, and that doesn't tend to happen. But with Cole, that happened, and it was an amazing fight from the Pascal fight on to the Jermain Taylor being the second in that sequence. But yeah, it was unbelievable, really, that Cole did exactly what he said. And he did actually keep a diary, Cole. He liked it. I don't know if many people know that Cole always kept a diary throughout all of his career. And sort of in the build-up to this fight in particular, and I quote, he said, I've been doing the same 6-mile run in Nottingham for the last 7 years. I normally do it in 35 minutes, which is under 6 minutes a mile. Recently, I was shocked to break my best time. So I'm running faster, I'm punching harder than I've ever done before. I feel so strong mentally and more mature than when I turned pro 7 years ago. Jermain Taylor is in serious trouble. And that was Cole Froch's quote just before the fight.
Not one for confidence, was he, Frotch? He had plenty of it, and this was definitely the early stages of the Frotch we know today, for sure, where he was so overrun with that confidence and belief in himself that people did mistake it at times for arrogance. And I think looking back on what he achieved throughout his career is obviously, I think the confidence was a big part of a lot of the fights that he were involved in, and he had to be confident to be sure he was going to go in there and win them fights. But that's for another day to talk about the career of Carl Froch. We're here to talk about the fight with Taylor today, and this fight with Taylor is something that will go down, as I've said at the top of the show, in history of one of them big upsets. Not so much because he was a heavy underdog in the fight. Yes, Frotch was an underdog in the fight, but it was more so the manner in the way the fight ended, and which is what we're going to move on to now. We're going to move on to the fight itself and talk about how the fight actually went down in our opinions and from what we interpreted. Now, watching back the fight, I noticed that Taylor, as you rightly pointed out a little bit earlier on in our conversation, Taylor came out of the blocks straight away, and he was the one that was on the offensive straight away. He was out there to take centre ring, and he landed quite a big right hand on Carl Froch in that first round, which obviously the commentators were really overemphasising the fact that he'd landed this right hand on Frotch. And what we know now is how hard of a man Frotch really is, because he could eat them right hands all night. He really could. And it was the start of what was going to be a difficult night for Frotch, to be honest, because let's have it right, this fight was a really difficult one for him. He was coming in against a guy who was quite tricky, and with Frotch being a notoriously slow starter, it was going to take him a little while to get going. And just alluding back to the build-up, one thing he did say, and one thing Frotch was counting on in this particular fight, was the fact that he wanted to pace himself because he felt like Jermain Taylor was going to gas in the second half of the fight. So he did come out quite tentative in that first round and in the second round, and Taylor came out the blocks flying, and he was throwing shots left, right and centre to kind of win them rounds, and a lot of them were popping shots, and he was winning the early rounds because he was a lot more active than Frotch, and Frotch really wasn't doing enough in them early rounds to justify winning him. And one thing I will quickly point out, Johnston, as well, is we've got Robert McCracken in the corner for Carl Froch, and one of the most notable things I took away from watching this fight back was Robert McCracken's advice in between rounds of the fight. The advice he was giving to Carl Froch was 110% the best advice he could have had in that fight, and the reason I bring that up is so much so because of the fact that Robert McCracken has been taking a lot of flack recently because of the defeat that Anthony Joshua suffered to Andy Ruiz Jr. in the heavyweight division, and people calling for Rob McCracken to be fired and someone else brought in. And looking back on this particular fight with Frotch, he knew exactly what Frotch was doing wrong, and he knew exactly what he needed to do to make it right. And the advice he was given, which can quite clearly be heard in between rounds, was some of the best advice I'd ever heard from a trainer, and it just for me reminded me of how underrated Rob McCracken was as a trainer.
I couldn't agree with you more. He made a massive difference in that fight. I think the one thing you will notice when you do look at if anyone watches, when you do watch the fight back, if the viewers do, I hope they do, is just the fact how Frotch took that information in. It was a great relationship they had between them. I think Joshua, like you obviously mentioning the Joshua fight, and he has, and Ross McCracken has been coming under unfair criticism. If it was one way, I think McCracken was giving Joshua the right information. I just don't think Joshua was taking it in. And you see the composure and the calmness in Frotch. You know, he didn't look worried, even though he probably felt. In fact, he was told by McCracken a few of the corner breaks, if you like, and he was mentioned that, you know, you are around a couple of rounds down, you need to do this, you need to do that. He was spot on with his advice, and you are completely right. And Cole was just, you know, he took that advice on board, and when he went out there, he basically did exactly what was expected of him, and he knew what he needed to do every single round, and he produced it. So I you know, going back to the fight, I completely agree with you that Taylor was, you know, he was working well behind that jab. I think the first round was close to call, because obviously, as you say, they kept on mentioning the right hand that Taylor caught Frotch with, but Frotch did catch him with one as well. So it was like a bit even that first round, but then second, third, even going into the fourth, you know, they both, especially in the fourth, they both landed left hands. Cole with an uppercut and Taylor with a stiff jab. But actually, I'm jumping. Sorry, I've just jumped right on the gun because we're missing the third. So the third round, sorry. So Taylor landed a big right hand on Cole as Cole sort of went on the attack, which clearly dazed Cole. He sort of tried to retreat a bit and recover. I think even afterwards in the interview, he said he didn't hurt him, but he was clearly hurt. He caught him again with a left, but I think Frotch again said I was a bit off balance. But in their second, eventually that big right hand come through, hit Cole, bang on the chin, and put him down for the first time in his career.
Oh, nice right hand by Taylor. That backed up Frotch, but Frotch steps right back and delivers a right of his own and smiles.
That is quintessential Carl Frotch. You hit him with a monster punch and he comes right back. He did that for 12 rounds with Jean Pascal. That's an important moment in this fight because Taylor hurt him. Taylor can't really go in after him now because he got nailed with a big right hand when he came in.
Frotch blocks the left hook. Frotch starting to get his confidence now. Taylor continues to pop the jab.
Oh my!
Frotch on the ropes. He may be hurt. Frotch backing up. Taylor moving in. Frotch is hurt. Right hand, and Frotch goes down. It's the first time he's been knocked down in his career. 26 seconds left. Can Taylor finish him? Taylor has him wounded.
Yeah, it's interesting you talk about that third round in particular, and that was the round where, like you just said, Frotch had been put down on the seat of his pants for the first time in his career. But a lot of it was carelessness from Frotch, because he was looking to load up a lot in them early rounds. He was looking for the more one-shot, concussive knockout power shots, you know, to get Taylor with. He was looking to really hurt Taylor when he landed. And the biggest mistake I think that was made in that fight from the Frotch camp earlier on, or Frotch himself, so to speak, was the fact that he didn't land enough combinations. He was looking for very much just the one shot, and when he threw that one shot, he was dropping his left hand a lot, and he weren't using the left hand to block anything coming back. So what was happening was Taylor would immediately throw the right hand back, and with the left hand being down on Frotch, he was catching him, and that's eventually what led to the knockdown. He caught a couple, and you could see, watching back on it, that the left hand was dropped slightly to around about his sort of stomach area, and this came a looping shot over the top from Jermain Taylor and one straight down the pipe, and that's what caught him. And he got a bit scruffy when he knocked him down. It was a bit of a scruffy one because Frotch was trying to be, you know, he's trying to sort of muscle his way to throw one of his own shots, but in the same process he was leaving himself wide open to get caught with that shot, which buzzed him and knocked him down. And the look on Frotch's face said it all, really. He was shocked. He thought, you know, you could tell at this point he was thinking, what's just happened here? He even looked over to his corner to Rob McCracken. He was like, what's just happened here? And again, I go back to the advice given in the corner, because it was brilliant. Because after that round, when he was brought back to the corner, he got spoken to, and he got an absolute rollicking from McCracken, because McCracken told him exactly what he'd done wrong and why he'd got knocked down there, and what he needed to do to make it right, which was to keep that left hand up when he was throwing the shots out, because he was letting Taylor come back with an automatic right, and that's what was leading to a lot of the shots that Frotch was receiving from Taylor throughout that particular fight. But yeah, you move on from there, and the fourth and fifth again are Taylor rounds, where I felt like Taylor was more busy, he was more active, he was landing more shots than Frotch was. But Frotch, he was coming back with the odd one or two shots in the fight, but it was just it was too much of a case of he was trying to look for that one telling blow which was going to hurt Taylor. And the talk of him waiting for the second half of the fight, looking back in hindsight of the fight and watching it back today, you can kind of see Frotch wasn't really putting anything on the gas at all, really. I think he was doing enough to keep the rounds competitive, but he weren't doing enough to win a lot of the rounds in that first half of the fight. But then we move in to the sixth round, and the sixth round for me was one of the significant rounds of the fight and one of the turning points of the fight, because this is where Frotch then started to turn on the work a little bit. He started to put the work in, he started to throw more punches, he started to throw more combinations, and this is where it became a much more interesting fight as we got into that sixth round.
Yeah, definitely. Following the knockdown, Jermain was just quicker to the counter, wasn't he? He was showing his quick hand speed, and he was beating Cole to the punch. And every time sort of Cole went to go on the aggressive, as you're saying, sort of trying to throw one shot rather than sort of following up. He was just getting caught. But yeah, moving into the sixth, I think that was the round when Cole sort of found his composure. It was probably his best round of the fight. He landed a big right hand on the button that sort of Taylor took well. Taylor tried with a late burst in the sixth, but for me it was a pretty clear Cole round, and he was starting to follow up with, instead of throwing that, he'd throw that jab, but he'd follow up with a right and even a left if he had to again. So he was throwing twos and threes, and he was starting to impose himself on Taylor. And you could see Taylor in and around 7. He was starting to, I wouldn't say he was tiring completely, but whether it was Cole imposing himself on Taylor and then Taylor on the slide slightly, obviously, you can watch Taylor fights and you see he sort of gets the championship rounds is the times when he hopes he's got a sort of a big enough lead to take into the rest of the rounds. They were close rounds again. I just felt definitely the sixth round in particular, Cole won that round as probably what is one of his most convincing rounds up until that point. And then round 7 was pretty much a battle of the jab. It was closer to Cole again. Taylor was landing counters. He called Frotch with a left, and then Frotch landed a solid right of his own. But most of the work was behind their jabs. And again, it was a close round, but Frotch was definitely starting to start throwing a few more punches, and then moving into the 8th. You call it, Sean. From the 8th, it was another good round and an excellent round, actually.
Yeah, it was, and I really enjoyed the 8th round in particular, because the 8th round was where we started to really see Frotch put the pressure on, but he put his foot on the pedal. He started to put the more emphasis on his combination punching as he'd not done in the previous rounds before that. And you could see this was where Taylor had started to slow down at this point, because he'd really put a lot into the fight going up to this 8th round. He'd really put a lot of effort, especially in them first 4 or 5 rounds. He'd really gone to town on trying to essentially put Carl Frotch away and get him out of there. And I don't think Taylor was anticipating. I don't even know if he trained for a 12-round fight. I mean, it's difficult to say now, without ever speaking to the guy, but it felt like his issues that he had in the Pavlik fight were still the same issues he had going into the fight with Frotch, and which is why Frotch was so adamant that the second half of the fight he was going to take him into them deep waters he always referred to. And that is essentially what he started to happen from the 8th, 9th and the 10th round. He really started to go to work, and he really started to get into range, and that was one of the biggest issues I think Frotch had in the first half of the fight, was range, and not getting into range to get the shots off against Taylor, looking for them one shots, just falling short a lot of the time, and that's what made it more difficult for him. But as he started to get closer, he just took that sort of one step forward, and it was that one step forward as he was throwing the punches which were making a massive effect on the fight, because they were landing more. Some of them landed on gloves, some of them landed behind the gloves, some of them landed clean, but when they were getting through, you could tell they were visibly more telling than what they were previously, and you could tell Jermain then started to respect the power a little bit more of Carl Frotch in that latter half of the fight. But he was starting to blow out a little little bit, and that was where it became difficult for him to stay out of range, to do what he'd done for the first half of the fight, which was to keep Carl trying to chase him down the ring, hunt him down, trying to throw them shots. And eventually, as he sort of moved into the championship rounds, it's where it became even more evident that the fight was potentially only going to go one way, but you just couldn't tell at this point whether or not Frotch had enough in the tank to finish the fight, because we know at this point he's starting to need the knockout. Going into sort of the 10th round, a lot of the ringside observers, a lot of the ringside press had Frotch 3 or 4 rounds down at this point. I mean, there was a couple of them that had him about, I think it was about 5 rounds down. I think one particular ringside observer had him down at, obviously because of that 10-8 round in the 3rd round, and then the rest of the fight they'd hardly even give Frotch a sniff in the fight going into the championship rounds. But the judges saw it slightly differently, which we'll talk about in a few moments when we come to the end of the fight. But yeah, going into the championship rounds then, Johnston, this is really where we started to get the excitement that we'd been waiting for from Carl Frotch.
Yeah, it was pretty much Taylor working behind that jab, wasn't it? And he did try to take out Frotch early. Obviously, he did clearly start to tie. He was quite happy to fight on the outside, going into the championship rounds. But I mean, round 9 was pretty even, to be fair. It was a close one to call, and that's basically all I've put down for the 9th, because I think the 8th round where Cole was pretty dominant, I felt at times. Obviously, Taylor was catching Frotch on the counter, and then there was a late burst. Taylor was, it was a little flurry right at the end, and he caught a big left uppercut, eye-catching uppercut, which clearly hurt Frotch. So the 9th round was a little bit, whether Cole was still a bit buzzed maybe, or he didn't quite really grabbed the initiative, but it wasn't until sort of round 10, and again you alluded to McCracken, and I've got even down here, from my notes, he even said, like, you 2-3 rounds down, you need to win the 10, you basically need to win the last 3 rounds. So that 10th round was a big round for Cole. Didn't disappoint. They threw more combinations, and he finally started mixing it up in round 10. Most from sort of round 1 to round 9, Cole was just throwing headshots. There wasn't enough on the body. If you're going to fight a guy that's elusive, you need to be targeting the body. And as you say, he just wasn't taking that extra step forward to get close enough to Taylor. So the 10th round in particular, again, he really went on the incentive, mixing up his shots a lot more, started to work the body. Taylor was, he was still in the fight. I'm not saying that sort of Frotch was dominating it, but it was just a matter of Taylor thinking, I just want to get past this fight now. I think that was what Taylor. You could see sort of even in round 11, or sort of going into round 11, right at the end of round 10, their corner is more, how long have we got left? Am I further enough ahead to just see these 2 rounds out? Where if you look on the other corner, you've got McCracken saying, you need these 2 rounds, Cole. You need to win these 2 rounds. You're behind on the scorecards. And that was wearing Frotch up. See the impact on Frotch and the difference between the two. You had Taylor on the defensive, and then you had Cole on the attack, and that was pretty much how it was going. And then obviously round 11, it was another big round for Cole. I'll leave it to talk about the 11th before we go into the 12th show.
Yeah, the 11th, I will tell you what, it was great, weren't it? It was really good to watch back on today. I was watching back on the fight again, and I was just like, this was really where it started completely hotting up. As you rightly pointed out, Rob McCracken's basically telling Carl at this point, you need to finish this guy off. He's tired. You need to finish him off. You need to get in there now, and you need to start throwing more punches, and you need to be more combinations going in, because he could put the foot on the pedal and finish this fight. And round 11 was brilliant because they both got some great exchanges going into there. And I think at this point, because Taylor was really, really tired and his stamina's really starting to fail him at this point, he can't escape. It's not like he could use lateral movement to get away and get out of range anymore. He's literally having to fight inside the pocket and exchange a lot more with Carl, and that was eventually what was going to be the undoing of him. Was you can't hook with a hooker. It's an old cliche saying that a lot of boxing experts talk about, and it's so true, because you can't get in there with a guy who can punch and fight at his range with the way Carl had them long levers, because he did really have these long arms, really long reach, and if you're getting close enough and he can throw them short, hard right hooks, they're going to really hurt you. And it was quite evident he was starting to hurt Taylor in the 11th round. Taylor, to his credit, he really did come back and buzzed Carl a couple of times himself, which was exciting, because obviously the commentary, the way they interpreted the fight, it made it really competitive in the sense that you really felt like this could go either way, as in either man's going to get knocked down any second of the fight. And that was just credit to the commentators for adding their part to the fight. And I know we give commentators a lot of stick because sometimes they come out with some awful things in commentary, some awful sayings and some awful ways of interpreting fights, but the way the guys at Showtime commentated on this particular fight were brilliant. It really made it into a better fight than what it actually was, because on the outset of it, it wasn't the most fantastic of fights, really. It was more the ending, which we're going to talk about in a few seconds, which is what made the fight as big as what we remember it today, because of the way it ended. Going into that 12th and final round, Carl Frotch essentially, on all the judges' scorecards, was behind. I think he was, or was it 2? I think he was 4 rounds behind on 2 of them, weren't he, going into this final round? 4 rounds behind, so he had to knock Jermain Taylor out to win. And boy, this was a fantastic round. This was certainly the way to come back from being on the verge of defeat.
It was an epic round, absolutely brilliant. Before we just touch on it, there was one thing I picked up on watching the fight back, was in round 11. Then there was a clear indication that Taylor really started to feel the pace that Cole had set the fight at. And it was for the first time he actually seen clean. You hadn't seen him do that. He was on the inside. He would be elusive. He'd get away. But yeah, that for me was a turning point. I think in Taylor, and I think even in Frotch, he was like, well, okay, this is different. I've got this guy. And obviously moving into the 12th, it was just epic, wasn't it? It was vintage Carl Frotch. Both fighters were looking for the win. They needed to. I think Taylor didn't need to win the round. I think his corner did say to him, you need to go out and win the round. Obviously, Cole knew he had to win the round. So they both came out, both threw good clean shots before Cole landed a big left that stunned Taylor onto the rope. The first time you even hear it in the commentary, that they were sort of, he's stunned, he's hurt. But Taylor managed, to his credit, he managed to escape Cole's aggressive, just he wanted to, you could see Cole can sense blood, but again, to Cole's credit, he kept his composure in there, he didn't rush his work. He allowed Jermain to escape from one side of the ring to the other, but, Cole just continued to stalk him, and then in the end, Taylor was clearly in trouble, basically. He was managing to withstand constant pressure. He absorbed some heavy shots from Cole. And to Taylor's credit, he really did take some massive bumps from Cole. But Cole, again, took his time. In the end, it was 2 big rights that eventually floored Taylor into his corner.
Right hand staggers. Taylor's in trouble. Frotch pouring it on. Taylor, he's ready to go. 1:45 to go. Frotch closing in. Carl Frotch gambling everything. His first defense on foreign soil against the former undisputed champ, and he's got him on the ropes.
And remember, if he doesn't knock Jermain Taylor down in this round, and they don't give him a 10-8, it might still go to Jermain Taylor. Taylor needs to stay on his feet if he can.
Taylor holding on. He ran out of gas. Frotch, does he have it in him? Frotch, Taylor staggering. They're ready to stop it. Frotch, Taylor still on his feet. Under a minute to go. Frotch again. Taylor, wild lunging punches, and he backs him up. Taylor trying to catch himself, using his jab, eats a right hand, another right hand, and he goes down. Oh my goodness! 30 seconds left. Can the former world champion hold on? Taylor in trouble. Frotch punches and punches, and it's over. I'm going back to England, Mom, and I'm keeping my title. Carl Frotch shocks the boxing world as he stops Jermain Taylor in the 12th round. What a fight!
Yeah, so we somehow managed to get up, and I think at that point I thought the fight was actually going to be over. I thought the referee were going to wave it off. I mean, the way he sagged into the corner was just like, this is it, he's done him after all this. But then, to his credit, he got up and managed to beat the count at 9, got up, the referee checked if he was okay to continue, and it was just more of the same, really. Carl stalked him down, he hunted him down, he picked his shots perfectly, and then when he trapped Jermain Taylor on the ropes, he unloaded a barrage of punches. I think it must have been something like, I don't know, just guessing, about 15 to 20 unanswered punches before the referee just decided to step himself in the middle of them, call a halt to the fight, and Cal Frotch had just defended his WBC super middleweight crown whilst literally being on the verge of defeat. Jermain Taylor was on the verge of becoming a 2-weight world champion by going in there and nearly beating Cal Frotch on points after what was a topsy-turvy fight eventually. And as I said earlier, I don't believe it's one of the greatest fights I have ever seen, but in terms of the way the fight turned on its head and the way Frotch was on the verge of defeat, essentially going to be losing that world title in just a matter of seconds. If that final bell would have gone, there was only 14 seconds left on the clock when the referee stopped the fight. If them 14 seconds would have elapsed, if the referee would have allowed it to continue for whatever reason, Cal Frotch probably would have lost his title on a very, very close split decision.
Yeah, it would have been his first defence as well. It was unbelievable how he managed. It was just remarkable how he managed to just to finish him. I mean, I remember, in actual fact, I listened to the fight, actually. I didn't watch it live. I actually listened to Mike Costello on BBC. And what I will say is there is actually footage on YouTube. If anyone really wants to just, if you love your boxing, just go back. There's no footage. It's literally Mike Costello talking for the fight. And, if anyone knows Mike, the guy's commentary is outstanding. If I know Mike is commentating, I sometimes may even do it on the radio, just because he's just brilliant, and he just gives you goosebumps. That 12th round, how he manages to just keep going with it, and just, how he puts it out there is just brilliant. And I mean, to watch it is brilliant. It gives you goosebumps. But to hear it through Mike Costello as well is just fantastic. It is just an epic round of boxing, and just the way Cole was able to, he knew he had to win the round, and to do it with, what was it? It was at 2 minutes and 46 of the rounds, 46 when it stops. It's 15 seconds away from winning it. Even with the first knockdown, he still had 30 seconds to try and recover. And he could have. To be honest, I think the referee probably could have stopped it. He did get up at 9. He did look sort of dazed. He didn't look quite right. I wouldn't have blamed the referee to have stopped it, but he allowed him those 30 seconds and to try. If he could have just stayed on his feet and sort of hugged Cole, but trying to clinch him. But Cole, to his credit, from the moment he hurt and stunned Taylor, he just wouldn't let it off. He knew he had to get the knockdown. And, when he had Taylor up against those ropes and he sort of threw, as you say, I think it was like 10 to 15 shots that were just with no reply. That's sort of Cole Frotch at his best. When he's got them up against the ropes, we'll obviously move on to Lucio Bute, but that is exactly the same finish, isn't it? The way he's got him up on the ropes, he's just pounding them with left and rights, and they just can't. There's no fighter that, when Cole's got a fighter in that position, I can't think of many guys being able to get out of it, and, he done a fantastic job against Taylor, and credit to Frotch. I mean, what a brilliant round of boxing that was.
I'm going to give Frotch his credit because he was one of the best finishers in the sport. When he knew he had somebody hurt, he would certainly go in for the kill and he wouldn't let up. And a lot of his fights, as you alluded to there, ended that way because he was so good at finishing his fights. He would not let up any his opponents, and that is something that we'll probably come on to later on down the line with Cal Frotch. And I didn't want to touch too much on the aftermath of the fight for Cal Frotch because of the fact that he was involved, as I said earlier, in one of the greatest runs championship wise in terms of tough fights that he was involved with that I've probably ever seen, heard of, or may never hear of again, because I do believe that he had such a tough run of fights after this particular fight. As I said earlier in the conversation, we was talking about the original World Boxing Super Series, the Super 6, with all the best super middleweights in the world went at it in a tournament to be crowned who's the best. That was the original sort of version of what we have today of the World Boxing Super Series, and some of the nights there were legendary nights. Some nights that we can talk about in episodes in the future that we can certainly sit down and talk about. The Lucian Bute fight, the Kessler fights, the fights with Groves. We've already covered one Frotch and Groves fight, and there's still another one there that was just as legendary as the first one. So I didn't want to touch too much on the aftermath of Froch's career, other than saying that this particular night, on his second coming in America, essentially his American debut as a champion, he certainly came and delivered on that night, and what a fantastic night to do it on. But I think we've got to really look at the aftermath for Mr. Jermain Taylor, because Jermain Taylor, after this fight, he actually was involved in some pretty decent fights. When he lost to Carl Frotch, he then went in with Abraham and lost to Abraham via a KO in a similar fashion, really. He was quite a way ahead against Arthur Abraham, who was also undefeated, 30-0 at the time Taylor fought him. But then his stamina just let him down again, and he got stopped by Arthur Abraham. But if you look on the record of Jermain Taylor, and you talk about what he did at the end of his career, he beat a young Caleb Truax, who was 18-0 at the time, beat him by unanimous decision, and we know Caleb Truax would go on to beat James DeGale for the IBF super middleweight title not too long ago. And then he ended his career, the last fight Jermain Taylor was involved in was in 2014 against Sam Solomon, where he beat Sam Solomon for the IBF world middleweight title. So he'd moved back down to middleweight, faced Sam Solomon, who was the champ at the time, and beat Sam Solomon. And as it stands, it doesn't look like he will be making a return to the ring at this point. If he's 41 years of age, he's had some troubles outside of the ring that are well documented, but for all intents and purposes, his career really will always, the mark will always be left, especially in that middleweight division, for Jermain Taylor.
Oh yeah, definitely. Taylor was, that will always cement his legacy. You know, he still holds that record as the undisputed middleweight champion, still to this day, after beating Bernard Hopkins in 2005. So that's you can't knock that. I mean, that's unbelievable. And to repeat it and obviously sort of win the rematch was brilliant. But, touching on the Arthur Abraham fight, he was really, really badly knocked unconscious. Again, that was very, very similar to Carl Frotch, where, although I think Abraham was up on the scorecards, Taylor managed, he was put away badly. It was a massive, massive right hand that literally, if anyone knows Arthur Abraham, we all know how that guy can hit. And it was a part of the Super 6 series as well. And it was from that, he was so badly unconscious, he actually went to hospital and there was actually a bleed in his brain. And it was from that point that Lou DiBella actually turned around and said, do you know what, for his own good, I'm going to walk away from Jermain. And I don't really want anything more to do with his career, mainly because he felt that, he didn't want him to carry on fighting, which I think probably from that point he should have called it a day. Lou DiBella, people will say, he walked away from the early millions. Now he gets this bleed on the brain, and now he's just going to walk away. But I suppose it was, what do you do? Do you keep going? Jermain ain't going to quit. So what do you do as a promoter, as a manager? It's tough. But, he did go on, as you say, beat Caleb Truax. And then obviously just before the Solomon fight, he had the craziness where he shot his blood crew mate, didn't he? He shot him 5 times. Almost killed the bloke. So he went off the rails. He was on Facebook sort of ranting as well, saying he's never going to get beat by a white man again, and firing an automatic in the air. I mean, it's funny when you look at it now. I mean, even he was quoted afterwards, firing this automatic in the air, and he goes, "Fuck you, but God bless." And I think this guy's just completely away with the fairies. He's like, he was an olive short of a piece of that one. He literally went mad. So I wouldn't expect him to come back into the ring, but you never know. I mean, he was ready to go down for a 19-year sentence, and it got suspended. I've never known anyone have a 19-year sentence suspended, but that's what it is. I'm not quite too sure what Jermain's doing at the minute, but going back to the boxing, the guy is still, he was a bronze medalist at Sydney Games, a 2-time middleweight champion, and he still holds that record for holding. Being undisputed middleweight champion.
He certainly does that, and it's really obviously sad to hear about all the stuff that has happened in the past couple of years with Jermain Taylor, and obviously a lot of it has been brought on by himself, but it is just kind of sad to see what sometimes life after boxing can do to fighters. But for Carl Frotch, like we said, and we've talked about on numerous occasions, he went on to have a wonderful career and some legendary nights, which we'll definitely be talking about in the future. But Jermain Taylor, Carl Frotch, what a night, what an epic comeback it was from Carl Frotch. After being on the verge of defeat, he managed to pull it out of the bag, he managed to win, defend his title for the first time in emphatic fashion with only 14 seconds left on the clock in round number 12. Simply one of the best nights in British boxing recent memory, and so many people responded to the little clip that we put out on social media a couple of days back about this fight winning the poll. So many people have so many good memories of this particular ending of the fight. It's why it's a legendary night. It's why it's come up in the poll. It's why it's been voted for as the one to talk about in this week's episode, and it just leaves me with some fantastic memories of what was an absolutely fantastic comeback.
Oh, it was amazing. It was epic performance from Carl, and that sequence, it started from Jean Pascal, and the second part was Taylor, and then from there it was just, it was constant big fights, every fight. So the only one in there you could probably say is Yusuf Mack, probably the one that was probably, I think it was a defence, wasn't it, the RBF, I think it was a mandatory fight. Yeah. So, but other than that, it's an incredible sequence, and he'll always be remembered as a fighter that fought everybody, and I've got utmost respect for Cohen. A fact that maybe not everybody knows, but apparently he fought in front of 80,000 people at Wembley. I don't know if you remember that one. But yeah, I'm sure he will remind everyone that, he's a confident guy, Nicole. As you say, he's borderline arrogant sometimes, but he is quite a character. He will go down as one of the top 20 British fighters of boxing, in boxing history. So, but a great fight, great night. And brilliant. As I say, just it was tight as well. I mean, with the poll you put out there, you had Pacquiao and Marquez, and you had Taylor, Meldrick Taylor and Chavez. So you got 3 fights with Frotch and Taylor, and Frotch and Taylor come out on top. So shows you the pedigree they're up against. It was tight, that vote, but I'm not surprised, because this is a brilliant. Just the 12th round makes it just an epic fight.
Yeah, unbelievable fight, and that is the end of our episode covering Frotch versus Taylor. So if you have enjoyed listening to this episode, please go and let us know on social media at BTR Boxing Pod on Twitter and BTR Boxing Podcast on Facebook as well. You can also go and subscribe to us, please do. Apple Podcasts is the main platform to go and find us on. Subscribe, get all the latest episodes, rate and review us. It's really appreciated. If you do use other podcasting apps that are out there, Podbean, Stitcher, Spreaker, Player FM, even Spotify are also available with our podcast on there every single week, bringing you different episodes. Again, we really appreciate you listening to this episode. This was the tale of Carl Frotch versus Jermain Taylor from 2009.
And right now, Thomas Hearns is an open book for Ray Leonard. Backs up against the ropes.
This is one of the most unusual calls by a referee in the history of the sport.
The first loss, a tremendous victory. Leonard fighting off the ropes.
It happened! It happened! The